Did Genesis chapters 1 through 3 borrow elements from much earlier Mesopotamian mythological stories? Brace yourself as we explore the linguistic, lexical, and thematic connections between these ancient myths, such as the Enuma Elish and the Genesis narrative. But let's not overlook the implications of such borrowing. Shouldn't this compel open-minded individuals to question the literal truth of these stories? Before we proceed, let's address some crucial points. The Hebrew language, as recorded in the earliest texts, dates back perhaps to the 10th century BCE, while the Mesopotamian myths, etched onto clay tablets, are often over 1,000 years older. Contrary to mistaken assumptions, the Hebrew Bible's creation and flood story contains Akkadian cognates from that much earlier language, not the other way around. It is essential to clarify this misconception and correct any misguided notions that suggest the other myths drew inspiration from the Bible. This factual inaccuracy needs to be rectified before we continue. Those who attempt to use Mesopotamian myths as evidence supporting the historical truth of the biblical narrative are quite frankly missing the boat, or rather, missing Noah's Ark altogether. Can we genuinely believe that Utnapishtim and his wife are walking among us, bestowed with immortality by the gods? Do we truly entertain the notion that Enlil annihilated humanity simply for being too noisy? Or that Marduk fashioned the cosmos from the remains of the sea goddess Tiamat? It's a resounding no to both, of course. As someone who was a Bible fundamentalist, I understand the profound impact of blindly following ill-informed teachings. Today, reading these older texts and understanding their original context has given me a richer understanding of the meaning of these stories. I actually love these stories for what they are, and it is my goal for others to enjoy reading them in their actual historical context, and not as if they dropped out of heaven. However, as we explore the intricate web of connections between these polytheistic Mesopotamian myths and the later monotheistic Hebrew Bible, it becomes evident that the Genesis creation and flood accounts were crafted using popular mythological motifs of the time. This realization raises critical questions about the historical plausibility and the nature of scriptural inspiration. Yes, the Bible is undoubtedly inspired, but by these pre-existing Mesopotamian myths that served as a foundation for its storytelling. Join us on this intellectual journey, my friends. Scholars agree that most of the primeval history borrows directly or indirectly from Mesopotamian mythology, and Genesis 1 is no exception. While there is debate as to whether such borrowing was conscious and polemical, or simply due to the overall influence of the myth in the ancient Near East, the consensus is that the opening chapter of Genesis almost certainly owes its existence to the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is an Akkadian story dating back to the mid to late 2nd millennium BCE that tells of the god Marduk and his rise to power over the other gods. The story begins before heaven and earth had been created. The two water deities, Apsu and Tiamat, brought forth the gods. Shortly after their creation, however, they became noisy and bothersome to the god, Apsu, who decided to kill them. Ea, however, in his wisdom, was able to thwart Apsu's plans and fought back.
Ea was aware of all, discerned their stratagem. He fashioned it, he established it, a master plan. He made it artful, his superb magic spell. He recited it and brought him to rest in the waters. He put him in deep slumber. He was fast asleep. He made Apsu sleep. He tied up Apsu. He killed him.
Having killed Apsu, Ea and his spouse Damkina take over his home and give birth to mighty Marduk.
His body was magnificent, fiery his glance. He was a hero at birth. He was a mighty one from the beginning.
Anu creates 4 winds for Marduk to play with, and with them he disturbed Tiamat.
He caused a wave and it roiled Tiamat. Tiamat was roiled, churning day and night. The gods, finding no rest, bore the brunt of each wind.
Tiamat plots to kill Marduk and the other gods.
Mother Hubor, Tiamat, who can form everything, added countless invincible weapons, gave birth to monster serpents pointed of fang. With merciless incisors, she filled their bodies with venom for blood. Fierce dragons she clad with glories, causing them to bear auras like gods, saying, "Whoever sees them shall collapse from weakness. Wherever their bodies make onslaught, they shall not turn back." Her commands were absolute. No one opposed them. 11 indeed, on this wise she created.
Her husband Kingu she promoted to the highest position, giving him the famous Tablet of Destinies. She proclaimed,
"I cast your spell. I make you the greatest in the assembly of the gods. Kingship of all the gods I put in your power. You are the greatest in the assembly of the gods. Kingship of all the gods I put in your power."
The great god Anshar called upon Ea to go fight Tiamat, but his response was shocking.
Ea went to seek out Tiamat's stratagem. He stopped, horror-stricken, then turned back. He came before Anshar the sovereign. He beseeched him with entreaties, saying, "My father, Tiamat has carried her actions beyond me. I sought out her course, but my spell cannot counter it. Her strength is enormous. She is utterly terrifying. She is reinforced with a host. None can go out against her. Her challenge was not reduced. It was so loud against me, I became afraid at her clamor. I turned back. My father, do not despair. Send another to her."
Anshar then went to Anu, another senior god, who gave the same response. It was only then that Marduk volunteered to take Tiamat down. Marduk then charges to battle, defeats Kingu simply by approaching, and ultimately kills the sea goddess, creating the world from her carcass. There are several possible points of contact between these two myths. Let's begin with the very first line of the book of Genesis. Along with John 3:16, many of us can probably at least start Genesis 1:1.
In the beginning, God created.
This familiar English translation has led to some interpreters suggesting that the first sentence in the Bible is of existential proof.
In the beginning was God.
However, the intended meaning of this first clause is not quite so simply construed as King James had commissioned. The Hebrew phrase that starts off the verse can be translated at least 2, if not 3 different ways, and the translation is significant for reading the rest of the story. Professor David M. Carr notes of this passage.
One of the first and most important interpretive and translation issues in this chapter is the question of whether Genesis 1:1 is a dependent clause introducing what follows, when God created, or an independent clause, in the beginning, God created.
While there are other interpretive issues involved here, like should this be considered creation from nothing? Our only concern on this point is Genesis 1:1's potential similarity to Enuma Elish. This story opens,
When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and demiurge Tiamat, who gave birth to them all.
Notice how the first line is part of a dependent clause. That is a clause that cannot stand alone in the sentence and is dependent on another clause. This is otherwise known as a temporal clause, describing a period before creation. If Genesis 1:1 should be translated,
When God began to create,
or something similar, then this should describe a situation before God began to create. The arguments are somewhat complex, and we need not go into them here. For example, Professor Robert D. Homestead wrote an article in 2008 dedicated entirely to the grammatical and syntactical features of this first phrase in Genesis 1:1 to determine whether the verse should be translated as a dependent or independent clause. Basically, there are several occurrences of this phrase in the Hebrew Bible, and they are usually translated with the word of attached to them. In the beginning of the reign of so-and-so king. This would mean that Genesis 1:1 would be translated something like,
in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth,
or more smoothly,
when God began to create the heavens and the earth.
When we continue the passage in Genesis 1, if understood in this way, the text is explaining,
when God began to create the heavens and the earth was...
In other words, this was the state of the world when God began to create. When we compare this to other Mesopotamian creation stories, and Enuma Elish in particular, we see something similar. Professor Joseph Blenkinsopp writes,
Genesis 1 belongs to the genre of cosmogony, narratives about world origins, and ancient cosmogonic myths in that culture area begin by describing the way it was at the time of the first creation, only then proceeding to the creation itself.
This is not only true of other ancient Near Eastern cosmogonic myths, but also in at least one other place in the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 2, the second creation story begins by describing the state of the earth before God begins his creative act. Carr writes,
the creation account that follows Genesis 1 in the Bible and likely predated it, Genesis 2:5 to 3:24, likewise begins with a description of the uncreated prologue to God's creation. Genesis 1 similarly begins with a statement of what creation was like before God created.
It seems as though this narrative pattern of describing the pre-creation state of affairs is common not only to ancient Near Eastern compositions, but also to the Old Testament. It appears that Genesis 1 is also following this pattern, perhaps modeled after the opening line of Enuma Elish. This possibility is strengthened by the presence of the Hebrew word tehom, the deep, that is found in Genesis 1:2. Professor Ludwig Kohler and Walter Baumgartner explained that the word tehom likely is derived from the general Semitic tiham, sea. So as such, it is not a loanword from Akkadian. Both Akkadian, the language of the Enuma Elish, and Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament, are Semitic languages. And the word tehom, Hebrew, and Tiamat, the name of the Akkadian sea goddess in Enuma Elish, go back to the Semitic word teham. In other words, this appears to be a case in which both the Hebrew and Akkadian are drawing on a similar source, but one may not be directly drawing from the other. This is an important point as we want to be precise when attempting to see connections and dependence between texts. As we noted in a previous section, one of the ways that we determine borrowing is the presence of shared language between the two texts. The more unique the language that is shared, the greater the possibility of borrowing. In this instance, one might be tempted to see a direct borrowing of Tiamat, the Akkadian sea goddess, in the word tehom. But this is not necessarily the case. Both words are clearly cognates, but we may not be able to say more than that from a strictly lexical standpoint. Blenkinsop agrees.
The tehom may be related to the same Semitic root as the proto-goddess Tiamat, representing the chaotic salt waters of the ocean from whose body the earth was formed.
What is noteworthy, however, is its place in the text. To reiterate the opening lines in Enuma Elish are,
When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first in order, their begetter, and demiurge Tiamat, who gave birth to them all.
Notice that following dependent temporal clauses, we see the figure Tiamat appearing in the first few lines right at the beginning of the text. In Genesis 1, we read,
When God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the deep. Tehom.
As in Enuma Elish, the cognate word for sea shows up in the opening lines following a dependent temporal clause. There is more to suggest that the tehom is meant to be connected to one degree or another to the sea goddess Tiamat of Enuma Elish. The word shows up in many other passages in the Hebrew Bible, many of which use the term to describe a mighty, awe-inspiring, and completely out of reach place. However, it does appear to have a more nuanced meaning in certain texts, particularly in some of the Psalms. In Psalm 77, it appears that Yahweh is doing some sort of battle with a personified form of the deep. In Psalm 77:17, we read,
The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you and trembled. Indeed, the depths, Tehomot, quaked.
This psalm zeroes in on the Exodus event, but the description of the waters here has a clearly primordial nuance. Professor Frank Lothar Hosfeld explains.
The cosmological insertion holds a unique place within the whole of the psalm. It is true that the emphasis on the element of water has an obvious association with the passage through the sea, the Exodus. But here it is a matter of the mythical cosmic confrontation between the superior God King and the waters of chaos.
Concerning verse 17 specifically, he writes,
In verse 17, the subterranean primeval waters are in terror before the God manifested in theophany. Here, the primeval waters are the direct opponents.
It would seem that the Tehom is personified in the text as an enemy of God that needs to be conquered. Similar, but not identical language can be seen in Psalm 104, a hymn that praises Yahweh for his power in and over his creation. In verses 6 through 7, we read,
You covered it, the earth, with the deep, Tehom, like a garment. The waters stood over the mountains. They fled from your threat. From the sound of your thunder they hurried away.